It's the Singapore Grand Prix this weekend, so today I thought I would revisit probably the second biggest talking point of the 2008 Formula 1 season. The second biggest talking point after the whole Ron Dennis paid Timo Glock to move over thing, or Ron Dennis can somehow control the weather thing. How people still believe that, I will never know. And thinking about it, that's a video that needs to be looked at in full, because 16 years later, some people still can't grasp the fact that dry tyres on a wet track don't mix. Just ask Lando Norris at Russia a few years ago. But in the 2008 season, it was not just Hamilton versus Massa, but there was the incident surrounding what happened at Singapore, something that has come up in the news very recently, with Massa seeking to get answers and/or compensation about that very race, and the fallout from it that started around 12 months later. This is one of Formula 1's biggest scandals. Two people copped massive bans, one of those massive bans being a lifetime ban, but has since been lifted. So today we're going to look at how Nelson Piquet being sacked in 2009 led to, well, all of this. So there's crossover here between my two main series, Storytime, which is this sort of stuff, the historical stuff, and Pressing Issues, which is the more current affairs type of thing, because there's going to be points repeated from the Massa seeking legal action videos in this video. The good thing about that is those videos were done months ago, so it's actually not a bad thing that stuff is being repeated. Also, neither of those two series had proper names attributed to them. They're just called that because those were the placeholder names. They just ended up sticking. But Singapore 2008 was a turning point for that year's season. It allowed Hamilton a way back into the season after a run of 4 races without a win. A run that had seen Massa win at the European and Belgian Grand Prix, with the Belgian Grand Prix being seen as very controversial because Massa had been anonymous that whole race, only to be given the win after it was deemed that Hamilton had gained an advantage by cutting the chicane as he tried to overtake Raikkonen. Just after this, the rain began to fall, and most of the leading runners stayed out on dry tyres, with Hamilton and Raikkonen barely able to keep their cars on the track. Long story short, Raikkonen binned it and Hamilton continued, crossing the line in first to then be dumped down to third with a time penalty. Many online have said that there was no advantage gained because Raikkonen crashed out, but it's one of those that's still up for debate even now. So Hamilton's run had been, since he won the German Grand Prix, a 5th in Hungary, 2nd in Valencia, 3rd in Belgium and 7th in Italy. Every single one of those races, with the exception of Hungary, being behind Massa. So Formula 1 left the European section of the season and headed to Asia. Well, all this kicked off. It's a controversy that doesn't even involve McLaren this time, because they had nothing to do with this. It happened with another team. Fernando Alonso had gone back to Renault after the controversial on its own 2007 season. He'd left McLaren after finishing behind Hamilton on countback in the standings and joined back up with his old mate Flavio Briatore. But the thing was, in the period between Alonso leaving the French car company at the end of 2006, where he'd won the title, Renault had slipped backwards a bit and was struggling. They hadn't won a race all year, and the best result of the season had been a second place for his teammate Nelson Piquet Jr. at Hockenheim. Alonso's best result had been 4th, 4 times. So the teams arrived in Singapore for the first ever night race in F1 history. The standings showed that Hamilton was in the lead of the championship by a single point from Massa. In third was Polish star Robert Kubica on 64 points, with Raikkonen on 57 and Heusinkveld on 53. Hamilton's teammate Heikki Kovalainen was 6th on 51, before a massive gap down to Alonso on 28. Then Trulli on 26, Vettel on 23 after his surprise win at Monza, and Webber in 10th. And Renault was looking good in the opening portion of the weekend. Alonso was fastest in 2 of the 3 practice sessions and was then 6th at the end of the first portion of qualifying. But then a problem with his fuel hose in the second qualifying session left him down in 15th place as he was unable to set a time. Massa took pole from Hamilton with Raikkonen 3rd, and the rest of the top 10 being Kubica, Kovalainen, Heusinkveld, Vettel, Glock, Rosberg and Nakajima. So with Alonso down in 15th, if he wanted to score big over the course of that Grand Prix, he would need some safety car luck. With the race underway, Massa, Hamilton and Raikkonen got through the first section and kept their starting positions. Kubica and Kovalainen made contact, with Heikki losing 2 positions. Out in front, Massa started to gap Hamilton, with a gap of 3 seconds forming by lap 10 or so. On lap 12, Alonso became the first driver in the field to take a pit stop. His super soft Bridgestones came off and some fresh soft ones went on, and he rejoined in plumb last. But just 2 laps later, a Renault was spotted in the wall at turn 17, a part of the track where there was no easy access for marshals, cranes or recovery vehicles to get to it. As a result, the safety car came out. The 2 Red Bulls of Webber and Coulthard and Barrichello in the Honda managed to get into the pits before it was shut. In those days, Formula 1 had safety car rules very similar to IndyCar, in that the pits were closed when the safety car came out, and then once the field was bunched up, then people could pit. I think it was something to do with like promoting overtaking or shaking up strategies or something along those lines. In fact, it's how Piquet had been at the pointy end of the field in Germany. He'd pitted just before a safety car period was called and managed to leapfrog everybody from 14th up to 2nd, and then briefly led the race before finishing 2nd. But in the pit stop melee, the thing that people call the turning point of the 2008 season happened. Massa pitted for fuel and tyres, but in Ferrari's rush to get him back out, he drove off with the hose still attached to his car, and had to park at the end of the pit lane while Ferrari mechanics ran over to him in an effort to get the hose off. Massa was given a drive-through penalty for an unsafe release as he almost hit Adrian Sutil, and Rosberg and Kubica were given 10-second stop-go penalties for pitting while the pit lane was closed, as they had no choice but to pit when it was, well, closed. The reason Massa had driven off with his fuel hose attached is because this was the early days of the teams getting rid of the man with the lollipop that was often seen standing in front of the drivers, and Ferrari, who were among the first to do this kind of thing, replaced the lollipop man with a traffic light system that now all the teams are using today. When the driver came into the pits with the lollipop system, there would be clear instructions to the driver on the board that faces him. It might say neutral or brakes on to prevent the wheels spinning up while the tyre guys are trying to change the tyres. Because, let's be honest, you don't want the wheels spinning in first gear or moving as the car comes up, or while they're trying to take the tyres off and put the new ones on. On the other side of the board, it might say first gear or something similar, which will indicate to the driver that the tyres have been changed but fuel is still going in, and being in first gear means that they should be getting ready to go. When the lollipop was lifted, that was the signal that the driver could go. It was a simple system, really. Ferrari's system, which was a bit more complicated, was automated, displaying a green light when the fuel hose was disconnected, but Ferrari had switched to manual operation for this particular pit stop due to the amount of cars that were going to be coming in. If the light went green when the fuel hose was disconnected, it could mean Massa or Raikkonen exiting into another car because, well, green means go. Always. So with manual operation, it meant that it would in theory be a bit safer. Essentially, there was a guy at the side with a button box that pressed a button and that would make the light go green, at which point Massa or Raikkonen could go. But in this instance, the man had pressed the button at the wrong time and Massa was released while the fuel hose was still attached. The way it shuffled stuff about was that before his penalty, Rosberg was leading the Grand Prix, ahead of Trulli, Fisichella, Kubica, Alonso, Webber, Coulthard and Hamilton. Alonso had jumped up massively, as the pits opening when everybody was bunched up meant that there were smaller gaps to overcome, so Alonso had gone from about 12th to 4th. Massa, meanwhile, was stuck in last from his pit stop debacle and the penalty. Rosberg was able to pull a gap before he served his penalty and only lost 3 positions. Trulli and Fisichella were on one-stop strategies, so once Rosberg pitted to serve his penalty and then Trulli and Fisichella were out of the way because of their pit stops, Alonso, in the Renault, was now leading. Rosberg made a second stop on lap 41 and rejoined 7th. Alonso made a second stop and kept the lead, with Coulthard coming into the pits with Hamilton, and Coulthard almost suffered the same problem Massa did in his bid to get out in front of the McLaren. On lap 46, Massa spun at turn 18 and lost a lot of time, while Sutil did the same thing but had to retire with suspension damage. So with all that done, the results were that Alonso had won the race ahead of Rosberg, with the podium rounded out by Hamilton. Then it was Glock, Vettel, Heusinkveld, Coulthard and Nakajima to finish out the points-paying positions, as it was just the top 8 scoring points in those days, Button and Kovalainen finishing out the top 10. Massa, meanwhile, was 13th, and without the second safety car for Sutil's accident, he might have been even further behind. So it went quiet for a little bit, but then it all kicked off again in 2009. Nelson Piquet Sr. told Motorsport magazine in 2013 that a few days later, Nelsinho had called him. Nelson recalled, "He said that it was all programmed and he'd been told to do it. I was quite shocked. How could you do something like that? I asked him. He said, look, you should know what the pressure is like here. They told me that if I wanted to be part of the team, I had to do what they want." Piquet Jr. said that he took the matter to Charlie Whiting, but without a formal complaint, it couldn't be taken further. With Piquet still at Renault, there wasn't much he could do. During 2009, though, Nelsinho's performance had dropped off a bit. While Alonso was able to consistently score points, Nelsinho hadn't been in the top 10 at any Grand Prix, except for one, and back then, that didn't score any points. So just after the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2009, Piquet was dismissed. Then the floodgates opened. On the 30th of August 2009, the Brazilian TV channel Rede Globo said that Piquet had been told to deliberately crash his car during that Singapore Grand Prix of 2008, and this prompted the FIA to begin a formal investigation. Previously, F1 insider Joe Saward had mentioned to FIA President Max Mosley that the whole situation looked like it was more than just good fortune for Alonso, but like Whiting had told Piquet, nothing could be done without a formal complaint being raised, and that Mosley couldn't investigate based off a hunch and speculation. Now, with a national TV channel stating this, and with Piquet no longer at Renault, it was something that was out in the public domain and had to be investigated. On the 4th of September 2009, Renault were formally accused of deliberately manipulating the race and conspiring with Piquet Jr. to fix the race result in favour of Alonso. The FIA's charges included references to Article 151C of the International Sporting Code, with the team called to a meeting at the World Motorsport Council in Paris on the 21st, which was the same week of the 2009 Singapore Grand Prix. On the 10th of September, Piquet provided his second statement to the FIA, with the transcript of the first statement being made available on an F1 fan site. Mosley is convinced that the statements are true, and in the second statement, Piquet explains that he'd been told by Flavio Briatore and Pat Symonds to crash his car, and that Alonso must have known about the plan, since putting a car that far back on such a low fuel load wouldn't have made much sense. The FIA then cleared Alonso of any wrongdoing. On the 11th, Renault announced their intention to sue the Piquets for making false statements and trying to blackmail the team in allowing Piquet Jr. to drive for the remainder of that season. Piquet Jr. made a counter-statement essentially saying that he was not scared of Renault or Briatore. On the 14th, Symonds was offered immunity in exchange for information, where he stated to the FIA that the idea was actually Piquet's. On the 15th of September 2009, the Times and Guardian newspapers published transcripts of radio conversations from the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix. I'll leave a link to the article in the description for you so you can read it at your leisure. The other article is behind a paywall, so I haven't been able to go and find all of that stuff and see if there's anything different, but yeah, here's some of the key parts for you. Piquet asks what lap he's on, and he's told that he's on lap 8. Symonds then says that they want to pit Alonso before he caught Nakajima, and they have a worry about Alonso's fuel pump and allowing 2 laps worth of a safety net. So if the telemetry said that Alonso had 6 laps worth of fuel, they were reading it as 4. He tells another engineer that the plan is pit Alonso early and then leave him out until lap 40. An unnamed engineer asks if that's too early, but Symonds says it's fine. So Alonso pits and Piquet is told that he has to get a stomp on and pass Barrichello. Piquet is told that he's got 4 km/h of a straight line advantage and that he has to pass Barrichello. But then Piquet is in the wall at turn 17, the place where he alleges that he was told to bin it to get the safety car out. Nelson's off. Fucking hell, I'd say that's a red flag, several voices say. Ask him if he's alright. Are you okay? Yeah, Fernando's just gone past it. Piquet then says, I think I hit my head in the back. I think I'm okay. Fucking hell, that's a big shunt. Briatore then steps in. My every disgrace. He's not a driver. What position is Fernando in? When asked about where Fernando is, Symonds says, to be honest, I don't know, Flavio. It's got to have been good for Fernando, but I honestly don't know where he is. Flavio actually used some fruitier words in that transcript. I omitted those words because, number one, I'm trying to avoid demonetization by using the F word too many times in a certain time span, and number two, I'm not a rapper. On the 16th of September, the Renault team said it would not contest the charges and then announced that Briatore and Symonds had left the team, with Briatore resigning from his position. The FIA, meanwhile, said that despite Briatore and Symonds leaving, they would conclude their investigation into the matter, with Briatore releasing a statement that simply said, I was just trying to save the team. It's my duty. That's the reason I finished. Briatore was given an indefinite ban from Formula 1, while Symonds was handed a 5-year ban reduced to 3. Renault was handed a suspended ban from the sport, but the FIA said that all of this warranted Renault being kicked out, but didn't go ahead with it because Renault had managed to get both men to jump before they were pushed. Briatore had also denied everything to do with the whole affair, while Symonds eventually confessed to being a part of it. Since then, Symonds ended up, ironically, working for the FIA, but has since moved to Andretti to be part of their entry into Formula 1. If it ever happens. Briatore, meanwhile, is back at Alpine, with a lot of mess to clear up. Part of the way the FIA imposed these punishments was due to the testimony of somebody only referred to as Witness X on the different pieces of documentation that have come out since then. Who this Witness X is, we don't know. It could be Nelsinho's engineer, it could be Alonso. Who knows? Witness X was known inside the Renault operation and had been given permission by the team to speak to the FIA. Only Renault, Mosley, and the FIA's lawyers knew who this person was, and that person's testimony to the panel at the World Motorsport Council stated that he knew about the plan, as did Simmons, Briatore, and Piquet, and Witness X had been opposed to the plan. After qualifying on the 27th of September 2008, Witness X had been in a meeting where Simmons had said to Briatore that they should stage a crash. The FIA was satisfied that Witness X had done sufficiently enough to distance himself from the incident to not be labelled a co-conspirator. FIA Vice President at the time, Mohammed bin Sulayem, said that the whole thing had been negotiated, but at the same time, everybody was happy. Everybody was a winner, to an extent. I mean, Nelsinho wasn't, because he became unemployable in Formula 1 after all this. The reaction to this was huge, not least because it followed two other massive controversies within the last 2 years. The first being Spygate, which also involved Fernando Alonso, and the Liegate incident involving Lewis Hamilton and his race engineer after the Australian Grand Prix of 2009. Eddie Jordan suggested that the resignation of Briatore and Simmons was an admission of guilt, while Simon Barnes at the Times called it the single worst instance of cheating in Formula 1. Meanwhile, Eddie Irvine suggested that the FIA had been a little bit soft on Renault and not kicked them out due to the fact that Super Aguri and Honda had just departed the sport, and BMW and Toyota were about to follow. So kicking another manufacturer team out wouldn't have been a good look for Formula 1. Elsewhere, the Renault F1 team's title sponsor ING immediately withdrew their sponsorship, as they couldn't have their company image associated with the scandal. They were due to depart the team anyway at the end of the season, but just went early. Piquet was replaced by Romain Grosjean, and during the Singapore Grand Prix race weekend, in the actual race, Grosjean crashed his car, at the same spot that Piquet did. So did Crashgate affect the outcome of the 2008 season? Massa and many people on the internet seem to think so. If he'd not left the pit lane with the hose attached, then he might have got a podium at the minimum. He might not have won the Grand Prix, but given that he lost the championship by a single point to Hamilton at the end, a podium, or any points finish for that matter, might have been enough to secure that title. But at the same time, there wouldn't have been that grandstand finish in Brazil. Hamilton went into that race 1 point ahead. He left 7 points in the lead. With just 10 points on offer for a win in those days, it might have been enough to make all the difference. So then, a look at the Crashgate scandal of 2008 and how Nelson Piquet being sacked in the middle of 2009 kicked off the whole thing. If this has been interesting for you, then do like the video so I know a good job was done, and if you want to see more of my big round head or hear any more of my dulcet tones, then subscribe with the bell on so you never miss out on any of my future dives into the history books or any of the current affairs stuff. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help keep the lights on, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliate links, and other bits and bobs that you might want or need to know. There's also super thanks if you just want to do a one and done donation to buy me a coffee, or memberships for those that want to do Patreon but not use Patreon. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.